Hello, and welcome to another of my Let's Chat episodes. But this week, there's 3 of us. I'm Claire Sands, host and blog writer of the Silent Why podcast, and today I'm doing something a little different. Because you're going to hear a conversation between me and 2 guests as they chat about their personal and professional experiences with loss. In these Let's Chat episodes, I chat to a guest, or guests as it is today, who have experienced or have expertise in a particular area of loss. And through these chats, I'm building a whole metaphorical toolshed of equipment to help us face and get through loss and grief. On this episode of Let's Chat, I'm welcoming back a former Silent Why guest.
Hello, my name's Peter Ellis and I live in Diss in Norfolk.
And his dear friend.
Hello, my name's Katrina McNamara. I live in the Midlands and I'm a retired nurse.
Both are based in England, though miles apart, and have known each other for many years.
I first met Katrina when I was running a hospice as chief executive, and I was introduced to her because I went to see her in the Department of Health where she was working. I remember sitting outside her office feeling very nervous and shaking, thinking, oh my goodness, I'm meeting the big cheese.
Yes, I was working at the Department of Health, and early in the time of being at the department, the death of Princess Diana meant that we were looking to develop the part of the national memorial for her. That was around children's palliative care. We developed a team of Diana nurses. So Peter was the first chief executive from the children's hospice sector to make his way to my doors to say hello and to offer support in that development.
Due to their line of work in children's palliative care, Peter and Katrina have been having chats about loss for many years, as well as supporting each other through their own losses. In episode 47 and loss 32 of 101, we spoke to Peter in detail about the loss of physical abilities that he encountered through a stroke. And after that interview, he approached me to see if I'd help record and facilitate one of his many conversations with Katrina, because they didn't really know how to go about it themselves. They'd even considered making an episode of a podcast themselves before they found the Silent Why. Well, never one to turn down a deep conversation about loss, I happily agreed, and this episode is the result of our recording. Between the 3 of us, we cover many types of losses, including childlessness, cancer, stroke, bereavement, loss of parents, pets, health, abilities, and more. Peter and Katrina wanted to explore what the similarities and differences are when living through different losses, and what we can learn from our own experience about how to handle loss with others. Some of the losses Peter and Katrina have been through include the loss of Peter's parents, which was complicated to grieve.
I had a very difficult relationship with my father anyway, so when he died, there's a mixture of feelings and emotions as a result of that. Then equally my mother, I had a tricky relationship with. We loved each other, I know that. But one thing that I felt afterwards was I never was able to express how I felt about our relationship.
His retirement and leaving something he'd built up over many years in the hands of someone else.
Left work in August 2017, partly because I wasn't feeling so well. And Richard House, which is the Children's Hospice I was chief executive at, was my baby. And I basically set it up. So leaving that behind and handing on to somebody, that was very difficult indeed. And I remember saying in my leaving speech, please look after my baby.
And the more recent physical losses that he's faced.
I had a stroke 4 years ago, 6 months after I had taken early retirement. It's just been massive, not being able to use my left hand or arm, and I walk very poorly. So I'm watching other people do things is particularly distressing because you think, I can't do that anymore. I can't ride my bike, for instance. I can't walk down the street easily. I'm bound into a wheelchair when I go down the road. My big thing for me is thinking, oh my goodness, this is going to be possibly for the rest of my life. And that's really hard to take on board.
Katrina actually grew up recognising loss.
So I was an only child and certainly made up for it by having lots of pets and an Irish grandmother. So death was something that was marked in a religious way. So all of my pets, and that would include caterpillars, goldfish, tortoises, all sorts of animals, would have that loss marked. And I think that sort of had an impact in that it meant you talked about loss, you talked about death.
But then faced it through a cancer diagnosis, which had a huge impact on her career and family life.
In 2003, I was diagnosed with breast cancer and was off work for 3 months, in which time there was a major reorganisation and my job disappeared. As my job disappeared, it then meant I could have had an alternative job. But to me, working in the field that I'd chosen, which is children's nursing, was really important. So there was that loss as well that was combined with the later outcomes around cancer. So childlessness and various restrictions, I suppose.
Then, in 2015, she faced the sudden loss of her husband Andrew, followed by the loss of her parents.
It was completely unexpected. He was literally on a telephone call and suddenly collapsed and died. And that was followed in 2019 when my mum died following a lot of illness and more recently the diagnosis of dementia. And that was followed a year later with my dad dying.
Peter and Katrina also talk about the effects of social media, expectations, the impact others can have on us, comparison between losses, triggers, helping others in their loss, and so much more. There's so much wisdom on living through loss in this conversation. So grab a nice cuppa, a coffee, or maybe a good old tap water, if that's safe where you are, and relax with me, Peter and Katrina, as we chat living with loss. Tell us a little bit about how you started basically talking together about loss, because I know you've had these conversations prior to this.
Well, after I lost my job at the Department of Health, I think it was Christmas Eve, I had a phone call from Peter saying, can you help? They had a vacancy at the Children's Hospice and I agreed I'd go and work 2 or 3 days a week at Richard House with him. That was as an interim director of care. So that meant working closely with Peter. We'd worked closely beforehand around children's palliative care. We were both involved in national activities. So we had those conversations about death and dying. We then worked together in a field where there was death, there was loss, there was a lot of loss for families. And that doesn't just mean the death of their child, it means sometimes from diagnosis, that recognition that they are going to lose their child in terms of death, but also around ability. So we'd had lots of conversations about death and dying. And then as time went on, we maintained the national contact that we had and international contact. So we went to Belarus to talk about developing services there. We went to India. And I think in India, we probably saw the most incredible services with very few resources, and it really helped us sort of put into practice our belief that something around death and dying, grief and loss is something that we've lost. We've professionalized that in the UK in a way that doesn't happen in other countries. So that's really where our talking about grief and loss has sort of, well, where it came from. And we've both been around for one another since those early days when facing loss. I certainly found it very, very reassuring and comforting when Peter came to Andrew, my husband's funeral. And also knowing that he understood grief and loss. It meant I could talk to him. We always talk about Andrew. We've never stopped saying his name. I think that's really important for me.
Yes, I always remember very, very clearly. I was sitting in my flat at the time and my phone started to ring and I saw the name of our chief executive of our national body that Katrina used to work for. And I thought, what on earth she's calling me for at 11 o'clock at night? And I answered the phone and she said, Katrina's Andrew has just died. And I said, what? What's going on? And she said she's in A&E at the moment and she's probably coming home. I think she'd appreciate a call from you. So I did, and I thought, what on earth am I going to say? I didn't know what to say really because it was so shocking. So I guess that's one of the ways that we kind of link together around loss, because I always feel for Katrina a huge amount around what happened with Andrew. And I also remember at his funeral that Katrina said something about death, dying, loss and grief, which is one of the mantras we had in the work that we were doing. And she used that as a way of framing her talk at Andrew's funeral, which impressed me enormously.
So you've both, like you said, you worked around it. So you've worked around the theory of loss quite a lot. But how has that been different when you've actually had to live through it yourselves? Has that reshaped how you've seen these theories, or has the theory helped you in your loss?
Yeah, there's two theories that I've mentioned. One's the Kubler-Ross cycle of loss, and I think the first part of that is shock. And I keep looking back on what happened to me when I knelt down in the garden, and the whole thing went through my head at the time around, my goodness, what's going to happen now? And so that shock keeps coming back to me. So that theory helps, I think, in a way, although the experience of it is obviously very, very different. The other one is what's called the dual process of dealing with grief. And that's where you move between the idea of trying to work for restoration and then at the same time coming back again and accepting what's happened to you as you move forward. And just that kind of, I call it the zigzag model. When you bounce back and forth between the two, that theory helps me to think that's what's happening to me. Again, though, the experience is very different from the theory and the model.
I think it helps because you recognize that there's a cycle of grief. I think not only the theory of loss, but the experience of working alongside people who are going through loss really helped because you know that there's not really a linear process that you go through. You can move forward, you can move back. It's something that is very unique to the individual. So I think it's the practical experience alongside the theory. And I think knowing Peter through his loss, following his stroke, that's been an ongoing conversation. And I think it is a recognition, and we've both said this, that the theories are there, but actually they are a single theory, and the actual reality of loss and grief is that a lot of those mix. You may find that the theory helps, but the theory doesn't always fit your own situation. That has been one of the things that has really helped. It's acknowledging that there is something that we'll go through that's common to everyone, but at the same time, you will be going through that at your own pace and in your own way. And having Peter in my life has meant that we can talk about that. I mean, it's such a gift to be able to talk through that. That has been probably more important than the actual theory. But it's great to have those conversations and explore the theories, because once you start exploring the theories, you start to think about your own reactions as well.
From my point of view, I think the reality of it, as Katrina says, is something that's quite different from perhaps what you've experienced before. So, again, working in the field of children's palliative care and the theory is all very well, but now the reality is something quite different.
Do you think going through the losses that you've both been through, does it make it easier or harder to be around other people that are going through loss?
Yes, I've set up a support group in Dis, where I live, and there's obviously a number of people there. And I think one of the things that has been helpful, you don't necessarily have to say anything, but you can just sit there and you can talk with each other, but you have that understanding with it between each other. And one of the things people keep saying is keep going, keep looking forward, because it's going to get better. Not completely, obviously, but it's going to get better in different ways for you.
The fact that I've experienced loss has helped me understand that sometimes you do want to talk about it, sometimes you don't. And it really is taking your lead from the other person. And I think taking your lead from them gives them space, it gives them the opportunity to talk. And I think that opportunity to talk about my various losses, it's the opportunity that makes the difference. It's actually not being silent. So I think it has helped talking to other people about loss. And in terms of the families that we worked with in a professional way, it's actually recognizing that complete breadth of loss. And I think for me, being alongside Peter through his loss and hearing his thoughts and his feelings has actually probably helped me more in terms of working with young people who are facing life-limiting illnesses than my own experiences. So I think it is that sort of opportunity to talk, the opportunity to hear, and perhaps not just look at platitudes, because I think that's probably something that I would say I was guilty of previously. There are some phrases that are useful, that we would all possibly use, but at the same time thinking about the words that you're using and not rushing to find those words.
And so Katrina says it's that space and time to acknowledge things and just not to say anything particularly, but just to be there.
Yeah, it's a really difficult one. We hear a lot of people talking on the podcast about other people and either the responses they've given. It goes both ways. They can make a huge difference in helping us and they can make a huge difference in setting us back. And I still don't quite know how much of it is us needing to expect them to change or needing to change ourselves to just learn it's going to happen and we need to navigate through it. And I don't know where that line is and how it's very easy for us to also project dreams onto other people. So I might look at somebody else living let's say a normal life with children or something and start to project onto them, well, they're living the dream because they've got what I haven't got, when actually that might not have even been their dream and I might need to reshape my dream. And I can't work out where the balance is between other people and me needing to change. Have you got any thoughts or experiences on where that balance is?
What struck me when you're saying that is it's about something I've always thought about is giving meaning and purpose to what's happened so that you can start thinking, how can I use this in a positive way? I guess that's my personality. Come on, we can get on with this and let's be positive and let's do something with this and let's take some purpose out of this. Otherwise, I think my life has always been filled with work and doing something that's meaningful and something that you can feel you can achieve, goals and so on. But yes, it's finding meaning and purpose in the middle of all this has been really helpful.
And yet it's tricky, isn't it? Because even if you're a cup half full person, you sort of need that positivity to come from within you, not from someone else who says to you, oh, come on, Peter, just think positively. That suddenly can send us the other way sometimes.
I would say that if I'm responding to other people, then I'm the person who should be aware of their situation, sensitive to their situation. And I think finding the words, especially if it's maybe the first time that you've met somebody after they've suffered a loss, so especially after death, you as the person who's bereaved, you don't know whether the other person knows if they don't acknowledge that. I had that situation where I met somebody for the first time after Andrew died, and there was no mention of the fact that I'd been on bereavement leave for 2 weeks. There was no mention of how was I. So some very simple little prompts that could have helped me by just making me think they do know, they don't know what to say, and that's okay to not know what to say. And sometimes even saying that can help you. So just somebody saying, how are you? And those sort of things, I don't know what to say. I was really shocked. Acknowledge the loss, maybe acknowledge your own inadequacies. I mean, a lot of people will say, just let me know if you want me to do anything. That doesn't help. I've noticed that more around illness. People say, well, just get in touch. Let me know what you need. Well, that's actually something else for me to need to do. So instead of saying that, maybe saying, I'm going to the supermarket. Do you need anything? Or being aware that there are certain times that you're possibly going to need more help going forward. And that may be important anniversaries. It can be birthdays. I think for families that we've worked with, they've talked about sort of when their child would perhaps be expecting to move to senior school or start school. When everyone else is going about their normal day, your loss can sometimes feel more poignant because you're missing that new anniversary. And the other thing is, we don't actually know what our loss has made them feel. I found a lot of people, when Andrew died, they really were almost rehearsing how they'd feel if they lost their loved one. And I think we probably all do that. But a bit like Peter, I think you sort of then get a little bit frustrated and say to yourself anyway, you don't know what it's like. You can't understand my feelings or my loss. Just hear them. Don't try to second guess my loss. Don't try and second guess my experiences, my feelings, but just be there. Acknowledge the person, acknowledge they've had a loss, but let them work through their own feelings.
One of the things that struck me about Katrina, which really struck me actually, was she was saying that the memories of what's happened, the experiences she had with Andrew, the cruises, the times they had together, and those memories have been really positive, really helpful. Katrina, I don't know what you want to say anything about that.
I quite often will share things, say, through social media where they've been happy memories. So, for example, recently would have been our 20th wedding anniversary. Earlier in the year, it was our 25th anniversary of meeting. And to me, they were incredibly happy memories. But then some people see the loss rather than the happiness. At first, and certainly sort of earlier on in my grief journey, I found that quite difficult because I wanted to be happy and they weren't letting me be happy. Now I acknowledge that they perhaps are still facing their loss of Andrew in their life and they need to express that. So yeah, I think for me, happy memories, that there's happiness there. You can be happy. That doesn't mean that you miss the person any less, but sometimes other people see your memories as memories of loss rather than memories of happiness, memories of experiences. It's about them recognizing that you'll move to a different stage, you'll move to a place of acceptance rather than denial, and accept you for who you are at that time and sort of tailor their responses accordingly. I think it's a bit sort of with Peter, reminding him of a very happy time where he took to the dance floor. It was, to me, it always brings back sort of smiles. But at the same time, I need to be aware that sometimes Peter may not feel the same way as me. He may be feeling the loss of being able to do that sort of so spontaneously. But I would never want to forget that moment of happiness and fun and frivolity and laughter. But at the same time, I need to acknowledge that, yeah, it's different now.
I was wondering whether memories were more of a comfort or a torture, really, for things that you used to have or used to do. Is it ever a bad thing, or is it always an encouraging thing?
I think I still haven't got through the process of that grief where when I look back, it is painful because you think, am I ever going to do that again? So that's experiencing that loss. But at the same time, when Katrina comes and reminds me of dancing around that flipping brush, which is ridiculous, it does make me smile and makes me think, gosh, I did do that. Gosh, and I can remember that. And that memory is actually important. I don't want to lose that. But at the same time, I'm thinking, would I ever be able to dance again? And having said that, the other day, I put ABBA on and I danced around the kitchen very slowly, one foot after another, without doing too much, wiggling my hips a little bit. We filmed it, and so we can send it out to people and say, look, he's dancing again. And I thought, yeah, but that's fine, but it's not particularly very good.
I'm glad to hear you're dancing again, Peter. Okay, perhaps not the madness of the broom dance, but I think that that is it, is that memories can be bittersweet. I think there is that recognition that sometimes, yes, the memory itself can be so sweet, but the loss is so bitter. Whether that's listening to music or, for me, watching the England Ireland rugby game always brings into this a really sharp focus my loss because my mum and husband supported England and my dad and I would be supporting Ireland. So yeah, it brings back incredible memories, but it also does bring back the loss. Bittersweet is how I would describe some memories. But I wouldn't lose the memory, even though there is that bitterness sometimes.
We put a quote out on social media that came after chatting to one of our guests, Greg Williams. He quoted it. It's from the film Shadowlands, where C.S. Lewis in there says, "The pain now is part of the happiness then. That's the deal." And I think that really sums up the fact that to have the loss, you've had the happiness and the love, and you can't separate the two. They're so interwoven. And it made me think the other week about the expression, it's better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all. And I thought, I wonder how many of our guests would say the same. I would rather have had it and lost it than to have never had it, whatever it was. I don't know if it would be 100%. I don't know if it'd be 50%. But what would you two feel about that statement?
I think for me, the experience of loss, yeah, I definitely wouldn't have missed out on the happiness. And I think that it also sort of lends itself to thinking more broadly about loss through illness and disability. Because if I lost the ability to sing, believe it, nobody would miss that. I don't think I would miss that. It's not something I would do normally. But If I'd been an opera singer and I lost that ability, it would be completely different. And we've talked about this in relation to the families that Peter and I have worked with, where you've had children who've grown to be young people and they have perhaps never had that ability. So, is that family's experience of loss different to a child who perhaps had that ability? Whatever that ability is, do you lose it more if you have never had it, or if you lose that ability that you had it before? And I think that's where the better to have loved and lost in terms of people, because it's people and its experiences, are possibly quite different to when we're talking about loss through disability and illness, because there's that very different experience. Peter and I have talked about the things that he misses. They're all things that I think I'd miss the freedom. I could sort of understand that freedom, but they're perhaps not something that I personally would value. The important thing there is for me to recognize the importance in Peter's life. And I think that's it with loss. It's about not putting your own expectations on the other person. It's unique to them, it's their own individual loss, and acknowledge it as such.
I think that's exactly right. And to give a couple of examples, one is a friend of ours the other day saying, "You keep mentioning that you can't play the piano anymore." That's fine. So what? I can't play the piano, so it doesn't. What difference does that make? And for me, I think you're missing the point. This is about, the symbolism that I can't do that means I can't do lots of other things. I don't care that you can't do it. That's not the point. It's a metaphor for how you haven't been able to do things again. One friend sat beside me, someone that I've known for a long time, saying, "I do not believe this has happened to you," was really important, and that helped me actually.
Yeah, it's interesting. If you can never sing, you might not miss the loss of it like you would if you were a professional singer. But then if you put it into relationships, could you say someone who'd never had a mother or never had children would miss that as much as those that did and lost it? So it shows you how different losses can have different impacts.
And I think different losses with different impacts can also mean that whilst you may have dealt with one loss in one way, another loss can hit you in a different way. So if it's the loss of a person, then that person's has their own place in your life. The next loss of a person may be different. If you lose the ability to have that child versus having that child and losing them, yes, you've lost the relationship with the child that you've had and lost, but at the same time, if you've lost the opportunity, then you've still got your expectations. And I think that's part of it. So relationships, yes, matter, but equally, it's our expectations of loss and what that means, and acknowledging what that loss has meant to the person means taking into account what they'd expected. If we think in very simple terms of losses in love, we might sort of see somebody who is grieving the loss of a love who perhaps was in their life for a very, very short time. But what we don't know about is what their expectations were about that love versus somebody who's been married for 50 or 60 years, and we sort of think, well, they're dealing with it in a different way. That could be because they've actually had the opportunity to talk about that anticipated loss. And I do think anticipated losses are different to the sudden losses, because you do start to think about that loss and what it's going to mean, and maybe even some of the very simple practical things that come to sort of ambush you when it's a sudden loss. You can have thought about how you're going to manage those, and recognize that things that have helped before, whether that's a period of being alone or whether it's a period of being incredibly busy, if it's helped in the past, will it help in the future if it's a different type of loss? And knowing that we probably make lots of mistakes in our preparation and our expectations, but accepting that that's going to happen, but thinking about how we've coped with things in the past and using what's helped and losing what didn't help.
One of the things that has struck me more recently is using loss as a platform from which to move to the next stage. But that's probably based on my personality. But thinking about how can we use our loss to move into the next stage of our life, taking the lessons forward. But the reality of that, I think when you had an ambush, as Katrina says, is probably very different. And I know from my experience at the moment, whilst I want to find purpose and meaning and think about what does the future hold, am I being unrealistic now in terms of where things could be in the future as they were in the past?
So I've got, for the first time, a male and a female chatting about this together. So one of the things I'm wondering about is, as you're both talking about it, you must have both met people of the opposite gender who are going through what you're going through, just chatting to people or in support groups or anything like that. Have you found from your experiences yourself and talking to others that there are any obvious similarities or differences at all when it comes to different genders facing loss?
I recently had a conversation with a man whose wife died fairly recently, and he's now in a place where he wants to talk about that. We've been talking throughout that time of knowing one another, but I think for him, he said it's so different for a woman. And he was actually talking about the practicalities. So, for somebody who'd had a long term partner who had really sort of run the household, done all the practical washing, cooking, all of those fairly traditional activities within in the home, and he went out and he worked and he did the gardening, he did the clearing the gutters, whatever that would be, the heavier work almost. And talking to him really made me think about it, because I actually said, well, it's not just finding out how to work the washing machine. As a woman, I know that Andrew was the practical person. He was the person who could fix things. And I've had to learn how to do that, or recognise when I need to get somebody in to do that. It was interesting to hear of the practical differences that a man who'd faced the loss of his partner was feeling. And he hadn't thought about, if a woman was left without their partner, how they might actually react to the practical sense of loss. But I do think that there is a difference between male and female grief in many ways, because of the way we look at men and women in society and how people express their emotions. So I think as women, we are acknowledged to perhaps show our emotions more openly, to share our emotions. Our conversations with our friends will talk about how we feel, not just about the situation. And we're also aware of sort of the different impacts, for example, hormones have on our feelings. Whereas with men, I think we are still in a UK society where men aren't expected to share their thoughts, their feelings, their emotions. That to me is the biggest difference.
When someone's had a stroke, there's something called post-stroke emotionalism, which makes you cry a lot more easily and a lot more. And I was with someone not so long ago who's had a stroke, a man. He's a mechanic and he did motor racing and so on. So he's pretty down there, tough and dirty. And I said to him, do you cry very often? And he said, all the time. And I thought, so do I. And I thought I saw the relationship change a little bit then, that we both understood that we do cry and it's okay.
So what do you think the difference is between completely accepting our situations when we go through loss compared with just integrating it into our lives and kind of moving forwards?
I don't know that I will ever totally accept that loss. I suppose if I look at it very coldly, I can think, I know that that loss has happened. So I can integrate that loss while still railing against the fact that I've lost them. I still want them to be there. But I think integration for me is about the reality versus the ideal of acceptance. And I don't know that we ever get to that ideal. I think it is once you have experienced that loss, you integrate that loss into the future rather than almost accepting and that's the end of it. That's my own experience of loss, whether that is loss of a person, whether it's the loss of a job, ability, or choices. I think there's an integration of that loss versus an acceptance of that loss.
I had my driving licence, had to surrender it after I had the stroke, and also when I'd had epilepsy as a result of the stroke. But I'm delighted now I've got my driving licence back. I've had to do another test. So the excitement is, gosh, I'll be able to drive again and get that kind of independence which I've lost. So the reality is, yes, I'd love to drive without having to worry about a knob on the steering wheel and being very careful and so on and so forth. That's what I would like to be able to do, but actually I can still drive now, not quite yet at the moment, but I will be able to drive, and that will give me a sense of independence again. It'll be a bit scary, I have to say, whereas before I used to love driving, never thought about getting in the car and just driving off, but now I will have to do that, so that's the reality. And things like gardening, which I used to love doing with my partner, I sit and watch him do it sometimes, and I think, oh, look at that over there, would you please tidy that up and snip that bit off there, it's not quite right, and I have to point it out to him. But I'm thinking, I should be able to do that myself. I've got some long-handed secateurs which I can use now. It takes a long time and it's a bit of a struggle, but I can do it. It's different, but I'm hopefully be able to in the future be able to stand up without falling over and be able to do things in the garden.
Do you think we automatically live with this expectation that we think things will turn out well? And is that harmful or is it helpful? And is that just part of our society over here in the West? Because when you look at the world, there's nothing really out there that says to you everything's going to go great. You know, we see a lot of bad news, we see a lot of wars, a lot of loss, a lot of bereavement. It's a lot of bad things, but we still live as if none of it will happen to us. Why is that?
It's modern Western society. We're all expected to have good things. We're supposed to aspire to in our careers. We're supposed to be able to buy bigger and nicer houses and so on. Not expected to not have that. Now that's a huge generalisation, but that's kind of, when you watch TV programs, it always ends up happily, don't they, those programs? It was something, particularly films, it's all great and weepy at the end, but there's something poignant about it, but there's a happy ending. And I guess life isn't really like that for a lot of people. It never ends up in the way that you expect it to be, and you're expected to be in certain ways, and that's success. Whereas, I guess in my situation, I know I can't talk for Katrina, is that this is it now. So my success has to be looked at in a different way, and it has to be something I'm going to feel successful about, even though other people might think that's not the case, and I'm in a huge loss. I don't know how you feel about that, Katrina.
I feel that we do have huge expectations. And when we have setbacks along the way, that can change our expectations, change our hopes, change our thoughts as to what can be in the future. And I think that we may hang on to some of those expectations, but then as life goes on, you accept that you're perhaps going to not have that expectation. You'll give up that expectation. And I do think that in the Western world, we have lots of influences as to what those expectations should be. And they are so influenced by the media, other people who perhaps have achieved real successes, and that we need to constantly reassess our expectations. And I don't know whether that's because of loss, but I wonder whether that's just experience and age. I have very different expectations now than I did when I was in my 20s or 30s. Then life starts to change. So I think we do have a lot of expectations, and life's experiences, whether it's through loss, whether it's through achievement, whether it's through challenges or opportunities, then we change those expectations. Sometimes our expectations grow, not just fall back.
And Katrina talked about the media. I think social media is particularly bad at this, and Facebook. I probably shouldn't look at it, but you can see some friends having a great time, going on really big holidays. I feel like it's writing on their comment, are you having a good time? We're not. It's not quite true, of course, but everything on Facebook and what have you is all smiley faces and people having good times and so on, including what they've had for dinner, taking pictures of it. But, that kind of reflects, I think, how society views how we should be, which is about having a good time, enjoying life, having great successes and so on. But actually, the reality is very different, certainly in my life anyway.
Peter's raised the issue of social media, and I think that it is really really telling, that you see various sort of supported posts that are advertising the way that some algorithm somewhere has actually decided that you, because you are living in that area, that your interests are such that you should be buying into this way of life. And I think that's really difficult because it takes into account certain facets of life, but not your own life. And I just think that that can be so damaging and doesn't help when you're experiencing loss or sadness. So I think for me, being able to get people to take a break from what's harmful, and whether that is social media or whether it's even the presence of a person in their life that is causing more harm than good, is really important when people are facing loss and grief, because it's such a fine balance for them. So social media that has all of these expectations for you, we need to acknowledge that that isn't real. It's what people choose to share.
Yeah. And I think social media is, I mean, I've had my journeys with it over the years. I was on it a lot when I was younger, and then I went through a period where all our friends were having children, and it just became too hard to watch as people who were going through infertility. So I came off it for about five years, which was really healthy. And then I went back on it, but I do like how you can tailor it now, so you can still be friends with somebody, but you can mute them so you don't see any of their posts, which feels like a nice way of saying I like being friends with you, but I just can't watch your life. Sometimes some people's lives are just more triggering than other people's, and it's not that you don't want to know what's going on. You just need to choose it to not pop up when you're not expecting it. So I think if anyone follows me or is, friends with me on Facebook, they might think I just post loads of rubbish, but I post stuff that makes me smile. I post stuff that makes me laugh, and it's very rarely personal. It's all just the stuff that it throws in front of me that I like. And that's my take on social media. That's what I do with it. And of course I have to do it for the podcast, but I think the responsibility is now on us to allow ourselves to see as much as we can take, because if not, I think it will destroy you, because it is people showing the best of their lives mostly, or it's people showing the worst of their lives, and either can be just as harmful to look at. And looking at that, the main problem with social media is comparison. Loss is universal, it's everywhere, it's inevitable, every age and stage of life it's happening, whoever you are, wherever you are. So there's so many losses, and there's that statement that there's always somebody worse off, which, I believe is true. I don't really think you can hit that level of the person who's got it the worst. You can always find another level of loss to add on to it. Is there any comfort at all in comparison with losses? And if not, why not?
I think comparison doesn't always work because it's not exactly the same loss as you. So in terms of comparing your loss isn't helpful, but comparing what's helped, or even there is some similarities, means that you're not so alone in that loss. So I don't think comparison is necessarily going to work in exactly the same way for different people, but you can hear the echoes of your own loss, and you can hear how they're dealing with that. Now, that may be that you're able to help them or they can help you, but I think it's just being reminded when you're in the depth of loss that you're not alone, because it can be the loneliest place of all. And having people that are there, that may just be standing in the shadows waiting for you to reach out, or offering their own hand and accepting that you may not actually want it at that time. It's really important. So that's how I would say that comparisons do help. But comparing your loss, it's not a competition. Comparison shouldn't mean competition. I'm sadder than you are, I've suffered more loss than you have, isn't helpful. But being able to see that people have had similar and have found ways of working through can help when you really don't know what to do next.
When I think about Katrina's loss and my loss, I just think, as Katrina said, there's no comparison because Andrew has gone. And Katrina said to me, not because of that, she's always reminded me, Peter, you're still here. And one of the things that struck me was when I'd had my stroke, Katrina looked up where hospital I went in, and she said, it's one of the better ones dealing with stroke. And I thought, oh my goodness, she's taken that trouble to look at that. Amazing. But what struck me is that Andrew's gone, I'm still here. but I'm still here experiencing a life that's very, very different. And if I'm being very honest, sometimes I think to myself, would it have been better for not here? Because living a life like this, you're actually living at kind of death, really, because you can't do the things you really wanted to do. And that's all gone, that's lost. So I find that difficult sometimes, very difficult. But going back to the social media point, I was thinking when you said that friends that come and see you or talk to you, show you the photographs of the holidays, talk about their grandchildren, as I'm that age now, and you think that's a little bit insensitive because I haven't got grandchildren. Same time though, you want to see them, you want to share the experience they've had in their lives, and that's positive, that's good, and I'm pleased you've come to talk to me about it because I would hate you to think you can't do that. But at the same time, a little bit difficult because I can't do them myself.
Yeah, it's a horrible tension that. I know that feeling with people with their children. You want them to talk about it and you want them to be natural around you and enjoy themselves around you and, feel free to share their lives. But at the same time, with some things you don't. It's impossible to know. It depends on how you're feeling, and there's lots of stuff that can come up. And I don't use the word trigger very often because I think it's become a bit overused, but obviously that is the word. You get triggered, your grief gets triggered when it sees certain things. Do you think, or have you found there are ways of coping with that, either ahead of time or when it actually happens? How do you deal with things that you might know or things that you don't know that come across you unexpectedly that suddenly trigger something?
For me, one of the things that I thought I should be able to deal with this is walk away. If you know that's going to happen, just walk away from it because there's no point you sitting there getting all distressed and upset and sort of switching off in front of the people that you want to talk to, but just try and move yourself away from the situation. And indeed, the Stroke Association give that advice that if you think it's going to happen, particularly with post-stroke emotionalism, as they call it, just move yourself away from the situation because that is not really very helpful. But I do feel at the same time, don't avoid it because I think it's important to allow that to happen because you need to be able to think about how that's affecting you. So I'm saying conflicting information there, but it's about at the right time walking away from something, but at the same time, don't avoid it.
I think it's about anticipating the triggers if you can. I think accepting that you will be occasionally ambushed by situations, by feelings, by thoughts, and knowing what works for you. So sometimes that can be walking away. Sometimes it can be expressing your grief, expressing your feelings. That's probably best in a safe situation. So having people that are your safe circle where you can talk about happy times, you can talk about the fun times, but knowing that they recognize that yes, that happiness is now tinged with sadness, and perhaps you're going to move away from that conversation, maybe not in a physical sense, but you'll just become quiet, or you may change the subject, or occasionally you'll want to just sit and express how sad that is. And I think for me it's about having that safe mechanism. In terms of work situations, I think that's sometimes more difficult in terms of working in an area where death and dying was so commonplace, in terms of conversations and trying to make other people's experiences better. Sometimes you'd hear a story and it would really pierce through whatever preparations you'd had. And I think that's the bit where I would agree with Peter that sometimes you need to walk away, whether that's, as I say, in a physical sense or an emotional sense. And perhaps if you want to, pick that up later with somebody. And in terms of being with friends, being with family, those that love you, they'll understand that loss. And sometimes it's okay just to say, I don't want to talk about that now. I might have been okay talking about it last week. I might be okay talking about it next week, but today's just tough. Now, I think anniversaries are really easy to predict, but I will revert to the social media issues. They will crop up with a today's post is, and it may be something that you're not expecting, that you've perhaps forgotten about. It may bring happiness, it may bring sadness. So being able to recognize that it's okay, however you feel on that day at that time, it's okay. In an hour's time, things will feel slightly different. In a day's time, they will. In a week's time, they will. It's the here and now that you just need to deal with. You don't need to think about the long term implications. So if you walk away from a situation because it's too painful, you can walk back into that situation. You can explain your thoughts, your feelings at another time. You don't have to do it if it's too painful for you at that time. But occasionally, some of the times when it is most painful are the times when you can actually share those thoughts and feelings. So it really is just accepting your own grief for what it is and expressing it if you want to, and certainly finding safe places and safe people to talk that through with. That's really important to me.
I found that sometimes when we wake up in the morning, you think, oh, I'm going to do this today. And then, bang, you think, I can't do it. And getting out of bed, for me, is quite a painful experience. But there's escape in the shower, because I think poor Duncan, he's going to have to think, oh, not again. He doesn't, he's very good. But I'm very conscious of that. So sit in the shower, have a good cry, finished, which is helpful. Something's happened during the day. I usually have an afternoon rest, and I think I'm going to wait till I get up to my chair, and then I can let it out without anyone noticing. Because for me, it's very important sometimes that people don't notice, because I don't want to give them a lot of grief as well, and them to start feeling sorry for me. I don't want that. I just need to get it out, and I just go away somewhere and do that.
The fact that Peter has shared with me that following his stroke, he can get upset, he does cry. That helps me if that happens when we're talking together. It helps me feel that I haven't said or done the wrong thing necessarily. It is a reaction that Peter knows that he has. I don't think anyone really wants to make it worse for other people. We all want to try to help in some way. So we can tell people what helps us, and equally, we can ask other people what helps them so that we can react in a way that is helpful for them.
So, in our society on a wider scale, what do you think the biggest gap is in supporting people who are going through grief and loss?
Talking about it, I found the recent public expression of grief when the Queen died quite reassuring, that there was a grief reaction. People were willing to talk about grief and loss, about what the Queen's loss meant to them, what she had meant to them. And I think that probably we started doing that as a British society when people were dying from COVID. We started acknowledging that people died. As a society, I think we have hidden away death and dying. In my grandparents' days, they talked about the loss of their brothers and sisters when they were children. They talked about the loss of grandparents. But as people have lived longer, it takes longer for us to experience grief and loss. People perhaps aren't sort of experiencing the death of grandparents until they're in their 30s or 40s. So our ability to talk about grief and loss has been lost in society. So I think that's the biggest battle that we have, because when we experience grief and loss, we think that we're alone. We think that we're the only people who are actually experiencing those feelings and those thoughts, and that's the loneliness of grief. So as a society, I'd like to see that we were better able to talk about grief and loss, that we can talk about death and dying. It's something that's going to happen to all of us. We're all going to experience our own death, and that means that we're going to experience the death of others too. And I'd like us to see a society that we can talk about that openly. We can talk about it, we can prepare ourselves to be better able to deal with it, because it's not such an unexpected experience.
One of the things I wanted to perhaps mention, which when I've been doing the work with our NHS colleagues looking at the pathway for stroke care, one of the things I feel is missing is, yes, they're very good at thinking about the physical aspects, very good at looking at the emotional side. But what about the spiritual elements of loss? I think particularly important in our diverse community, that faith can mean an awful lot to people, but it challenges their faith hugely, as it's done with me, about, what does this mean? That meaning and purpose again. And I put down here the existential crisis that can occur for people once they've had a serious loss, like a stroke. And what does this mean for their faith? And I think that's really important as well, to acknowledge that our firm in the statutory services is not acknowledged very well, is not dealt with very well. And perhaps in society we don't think about that very well as well. And the last thing is the whole thing about suicide. And this happens quite a lot where people have had a stroke, taking your own life as a result of what's happened to you, because, like I said earlier, you think, what does the future hold? Is this a living death that you're going through now? Shall I just give up and give in? I think there's a lot of men have this, commit suicide as a result of having a stroke, and there's something about their loss as being quite significant.
So, has anything good come out of your losses?
I have found that I've had the opportunity to reflect and really relish experiences and the relationships I've had with the people that I've lost. It saved me taking those experiences and those people for granted. And it's also given me a belief that I can cope. I can live my life despite the losses. The living my life despite the losses then has probably moved on to I can live my life, I can live a good life with those losses, being grateful for those opportunities, being grateful for those experiences, being grateful for those people in your life. So enjoy the thoughts, enjoy the memories, and be glad that they were there. Now I've had their presence in my life, it's been a gift.
One of the things I've always felt is important in this is hope. And where can hope come in? That can be a way of moving forward. Having hope, having faith, gives a direction of travel through all this situation.
So, final question. If I went into my shed to pick out my metaphorical tool that represented having lived through loss, what kind of tool do you think that would be?
For me, it'd be my trusty secateurs, because then I can clear the undergrowth. I can clear the things that are holding me back to be able to grow going forwards.
For me, and I've actually got this tool, is long-handed secateurs, just like Katrina. Mine are longer handles than hers. It means I can reach out and do things which I couldn't do. So having long-handed secateurs has been the tool I've thought about.
2 sets of secateurs, short-handled and long. I know from my own gardening experiences you can never have too many types of those. Some to clear away the undergrowth to help us move forwards, and some to help us reach and do things that we couldn't do otherwise. Thank you, Peter and Katrina, for giving us a peek into the conversations you have between you around the losses that you've both faced. There's so much wisdom and empathy here that I know it's going to help a lot of other people. If you want to find out more about Peter and Katrina, I'll put more information and links in the show notes. And if you need to know more about that broom dance that Peter did, like I did, then just pop onto YouTube and type in Irish brush dance. You will not be disappointed. And you'll be pleased to know that although it's been delayed a few times, Peter is hoping to get his car in March and start driving again. Peter is also one of the people that supports me through buymeacoffee.com/thesilentwhy, and so that's one of the reasons that you're listening to this podcast now. And I'm going to be writing a blog topic on his chosen subject very soon as part of what I offer for monthly donations. So keep an eye out for that. Thanks for listening to the Silent Why podcast. If you've got a subject you'd like me to chat to an expert on, please get in touch via our social media or the website, or via the email thesilentwhy@gmail.com. And let's chat.